A fortnight after the landings, this costly effort was brought to naught by an idea of simple genius. The man who wrote those words was Albert Speer. He wrote them in 1969, in a memoir composed in the years just after his release from Spandau prison, where he had served 20 years for war crimes and crimes against humanity. He wrote them about the Atlantic Wall, the chain of concrete fortifications that he himself, as Minister of Armaments and head of the Todt Organization, had presided over from February 1942 until the Western Allies came ashore at Normandy. The wall ran from northern Norway to the Spanish frontier, some 5,200 kilometers of coastline scattered with concrete. Speer's own count of what it had cost him was 13 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel. 2 years of labor by close to 300,000 men, most of them not German. 3.7 billion Reichsmarks in the money of the day, which one historian at the National WW2 Museum has converted to over $200 billion in present terms. 5% of Germany's entire annual steel production, pulled out of the war effort and poured into the western coast of Europe. Modern historians, counting the U-boat pens and the V-weapon sites that the Todt Organization built alongside the wall proper, raise the concrete figure to closer to 17 million cubic meters. Either way, the count is staggering, and the point is the same. Germany spent the equivalent of a separate war on the Atlantic Wall, and Speer himself, looking back from the cell where he had had a quarter-century to think about it, said the whole thing had been brought to naught in 2 weeks by a single idea. To understand what Speer meant, you have to understand the doctrine that built the wall, the doctrine that the wall was built to enforce, and the one assumption that Hitler, Rundstedt, Rommel, and the German Naval Staff all shared in common. It is the assumption that gave the Allies their opening. The doctrine begins with Führer Directive No. 40, signed by Adolf Hitler on March 23, 1942. In its opening lines, Hitler warned his commanders that the coasts of Europe were now exposed to the danger of enemy landings, and that the enemy's choice of time and place would not be based solely on strategic considerations. Political motives, alliance pressures, reverses elsewhere, all of these might force the Western powers to land somewhere they would not otherwise choose. The directive established a command structure for coastal defense, but the operative provision was simpler than the prose. The ports must be held. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, the Channel Islands. The ports above all. Hitler's logic was sound, given the assumption underneath it. No invasion fleet, no army of the size the Allies would need to commit, could be sustained by landing supplies across an open beach. Ammunition, fuel, food, vehicles, medical supplies, replacements. The arithmetic of supplying a 1,000,000-man army required a working port. The ports must therefore be made into fortresses. The rest of the coastline could be held by thinner forces, by static divisions filled with Polish and Ukrainian conscripts and walking wounded, by everything that could not be sent to Russia. The wall was not really a wall. It was a series of port fortresses connected by a propaganda line. That propaganda line is worth pausing on. The German illustrated magazines and newsreels, through 1943 and into 1944, ran constant pictures of Festung Europa. Fortress Europe, concrete bunkers along sheer Norwegian cliffs, heavy guns silhouetted against the Channel sky, sentries in helmets staring out across grey water. Most of the photographs were taken at the same place, near Boulogne, where the heavy batteries were real and where the lines were genuinely thick. The rest of the coast was thinner. In places, much thinner. If you grew up with a father, an uncle, or a grandfather who came back from Normandy, this is one of the stories that explains why he came back at all. A like helps the next person find it. Then back to the story. The men who built it were largely not Germans. The Todt Organization had been founded by Fritz Todt, the engineer who had built the Autobahn system and the Siegfried Line before the war. Todt was killed in an unexplained plane crash on February 8, 1942, shortly after leaving a conference with Hitler at the Rastenburg headquarters. Speer succeeded him as Minister of Armaments and as head of the Todt Organization the same day. At peak, in 1944, the Todt Organization had roughly 286,000 workmen along the Atlantic Wall. About 10% of them were Germans, mostly supervisors and skilled trades. The rest were Vichy conscripted Frenchmen, of whom the Vichy regime drafted roughly 600,000 over the relevant period, alongside forced labourers from occupied territories, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. Thousands of them died on the work. The concrete and steel of the Atlantic Wall is, in part, a record of who built it under what conditions, and that record is not separable from the bunkers themselves. Hitler also decreed that 1/12 of the entire concrete and steel ration for the Atlantic Wall would go to the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands were British territory, captured in 1940, and they contributed nothing to the defence of France. They were fortified because they were British. The propaganda value of pictures showing German troops in concrete bunkers on British soil was worth, in Hitler's view, 1/12 of the entire Western defence. By 1944, the Channel Islands had a concentration of fortifications denser than the Normandy beaches that would actually be attacked. What got built along the rest of the coast was, by German engineering standards, impressive. There were over 600 standardized bunker types, all designed under the Regelbau system, internal room dimensions in multiples of 10 centimeters, room heights of 2 meters or 2.2 meters, steel armored doors of 30mm plate, set into right-angle entries to defeat blast. Armored air intakes. More than 200 standardized armor parts that could be ordered from a catalogue. The smallest bunkers required more than 100 cubic meters of concrete each. There were named batteries that the Allied invasion planners learned to fear. Battery Lindemann near Sangatte, with 400 6mm Krupp naval guns in massive casemates, visible from the English coast on a clear day. Battery Todt in the Pas de Calais, the largest battery in France, with a 70-foot Krupp railway gun named Leopold that could throw a 562-pound shell 40 miles, Czech hedgehogs welded out of 3 crossed I-beams on the beaches, Belgian gates of heavy steel set below the high water line to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, Tobruk pits, small concrete observation and machine gun positions named for the Desert War, and there was Rommel's asparagus, Rommelspargel. Slanted wooden poles set into likely glider and parachute fields, with mines or shells wired to the tops. The poles were Rommel's idea, ordered after he inspected the wall and found the beach defences sparse and the inland approaches naked. This was the wall the Allies saw on their reconnaissance photographs. This was the wall the German people saw in their newsreels. Neither version was quite the wall that was actually there. In November 1943, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 51, warning of consequences of staggering proportions if the Western Allies established a bridgehead. He sent Field Marshal Erwin Rommel west to inspect the wall and to organize its defense. Rommel arrived at Lake Garda in northern Italy on roughly November 10, 1943, where he met the man assigned to be his naval advisor, Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge. Together they began inspecting the Atlantic Wall from the Danish coast down through the Netherlands, Belgium and France to the Spanish frontier. What Rommel found shocked him. We have it on the testimony of Ruge himself, written in 1946 in a manuscript for the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies program and published more publicly in June 1954 in the United States Naval Institute proceedings. The German papers and the newsreels, Ruge wrote, were full of reports and pictures of the Atlantic Wall, and the new arrivals from Germany were somewhat surprised when they could not find this wall. There were 4 heavy batteries near Boulogne, where the channel narrowed and where Operation Sea Lion had been planned 3 years before. There the divisions held narrow sectors. There was reserve depth. The photographers had photographed Boulogne. Move west, away from Boulogne, and the sectors grew wider. Move further west, into Normandy, and one weak division of 7 battalions held a front of 30 miles, with no reserves behind it. That is the wall Rommel found, 7 battalions holding 30 miles. A front line stretched so thin that even Rommel, the most aggressive defensive thinker in the Wehrmacht, could see at a glance that it would not hold. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior soldier in the West, was even blunter. After the war, he sat for an interrogation with Major Milton Shulman, an intelligence officer of the 1st Canadian Army, who was collecting the German commander's own assessments for the Canadian Army Historical Section. Shulman published the results in 1947 in a book called Defeat in the West. Rundstedt's verdict on the wall is one of the most uncompromising things any field marshal has ever said about his own side's grand strategic project. As for the Atlantic Wall itself, Rundstedt told Shulman, it had to be seen to be believed. It had no depth and little surface. It was sheer humbug. At best, Rundstedt said, it might prove an obstacle for 24 hours at any one point, but one day's intensive assault by a determined force was all that was needed to break any part of this line. Once through the so-called wall, the rest of these fortifications and fortresses facing the sea were of no use at all against an attack from behind. Rundstedt added a detail worth holding on to. He said that he had received the Führer's instructions for the defense of the fortresses, and that the wording had said, defend to the last drop of blood. He had personally changed the words to defend to the last bullet before sending the order forward. Even that mitigation, he said, was not enough. We subsequently lost over 120,000 men in these concrete posts when we withdrew from France. I always considered this to be a tragic waste of useful manpower. 120,000 men, stranded inside concrete that pointed in the wrong direction. The wall had been built to repel an invasion from the sea, and the men inside it died because the Allies came ashore and then attacked the bunkers from behind. The concrete was thick enough to stop a battleship's main gun. It could do nothing about a man with a satchel charge coming at it from the landward side, and after June 1944, that was the direction the satchel charges came from. Rommel reached the same verdict on the wall as Rundstedt, though he reached it in a different way. Rundstedt was an old Prussian aristocrat with the cold professionalism of 50 years in uniform. Rommel was a Swabian schoolteacher's son who had built his career on aggression and intuition. Where Rundstedt was scornful, Rommel was furious. The wall, Rommel wrote privately to one of his confidants, in language preserved through the editorial work of B. H. Liddell Hart, in the 1953 volume known as the Rommel Papers, was a figment of Hitler's cloud-cuckoo-land, an enormous bluff, more for the German people than for the enemy. The phrase he used in German was Wolkenkuckucksheim, cloud-cuckoo-land. It is a phrase Aristophanes used in The Birds, more than 2,000 years before, to describe a city the birds build in the air. Rommel chose his word carefully. Rommel's response to what he had seen was the doctrine he is best remembered for. On April 22, 1944, 6 weeks before the invasion, he stood on a stretch of Normandy beach with his adjutant, Captain Helmuth Lang, and laid out the only defense he believed had any chance of working. The war will be won or lost on the beaches, Rommel told Lang. We will have only one chance to stop the enemy, and that is while he is in the water, struggling to get ashore. Reserves will never get up to the point of attack, and it is foolish even to consider them. The main line of resistance will be here. Everything we have must be on the coast. Believe me, Lang, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy and who edited parts of the Rommel papers after the war, paraphrased the same view in different language. Rommel believed, Bayerlein wrote, that victory could no longer be gained by mobile warfare, not merely because of British and American air superiority, but also because the German armaments industry was no longer capable of keeping pace with the Western Allies in the production of tanks, guns, anti-tank guns, and vehicles. Rommel, who had been the master of mobile armoured warfare in the desert, no longer believed mobile warfare could save Germany in the West, stop them on the beach in the first 24 hours, or the war was lost. This was the man Hitler had sent to defend the wall. He believed the wall was a fraud. He believed mobile war was finished. He believed the beach was the only chance. After the invasion, when Hitler heard from Speer about Rommel's mounting pessimism, Hitler told Speer something Speer recorded in his memoir. Rommel has lost his nerve, Hitler said. He has become a pessimist. In these times, only optimists can achieve anything. Speer himself had walked the wall with Rommel in the spring of 1944. He records it in his memoir. He had seen the same things Rommel had seen. The thin lines, the sectors of 7 battalions over 30 miles, the bunkers facing the sea with nothing behind them. He had also seen the steel and the concrete that he himself had signed for, on requisition forms back in Berlin, going into a defence the field marshal walking next to him already believed could not work. The verdict Speer would write 25 years later in Spandau was, in part, the verdict of a man who had walked the wall before it was tested and known, even then, what he was looking at. So you have, by the spring of 1944, the two most senior soldiers in the West agreeing privately that the wall is humbug, that it is bluff, that it is a propaganda construction sold to the German people as a fortress, when it is in fact a screen. And yet they both agreed, equally strongly, on the same assumption Hitler held: the Allies would come for a port. Rommel said so explicitly. In his December 31, 1943 report to Hitler, written after his first inspection tour, he stated that the enemy's main concern would be to get the quickest possible possession of a port or ports capable of handling large ships. He predicted the assault would come in the Pas de Calais, where the channel was narrowest, where the air cover from southern England was best, and where the ports of Boulogne and Calais were biggest. The whole German staff agreed. OKW, the Supreme Command, was sure of Calais. The Kriegsmarine preferred the Schelde or the Seine Bight because the waters between were thick with German ground mines. Rundstedt thought the Somme. Rommel, by April, had revised to the Seine Bight. Every one of these guesses assumed the Allies would land near a working port. He was wrong, not about the doctrine, about where the doctrine would meet its answer. And here is the answer. In 1917, when Winston Churchill was Minister of Munitions and the First World War was in its fourth year, he wrote a memorandum proposing that the Royal Navy build artificial harbours off the German islands of Borkum and Sylt for a contemplated operation in the North Sea. The proposal went nowhere. The memo was filed. 25 years later, on May 30, 1942, with Britain alone in the West and a cross-channel invasion still a distant prospect, Churchill sent a minute to Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Chief of Combined Operations. The minute was 4 sentences long. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. 3 months later, on August 19, 1942, a force of about 6,000 men, most of them Canadian, raided the French port of Dieppe. The official Canadian history records that 3,623 of the 6,086 men who reached shore were killed, wounded, or captured, almost 60%. The Canadians alone lost 3,367 of roughly 5,000 engaged. Dieppe is sometimes spoken of as a failure in search of a lesson. It found one. To the Germans, Dieppe confirmed that no Allied force could seize a defended port by frontal assault. Hitler's port fixation doctrine was vindicated. The wall could continue to be built around the ports. To the Allies, Dieppe taught the opposite lesson. The army would not be taking a port by frontal assault. The army would have to bring its own. The engineering competition began. 3 concepts went to trial at Garlieston, on Wigtown Bay on the Scottish coast, in the late summer of 1943. Hugh Ioris Hughes, the civil engineer who had built parts of Wembley Stadium and the Hyde Park Corner underpass, designed the Hippo Pier, with concrete caissons sunk in place and the Crocodile Bridge spans. Ronald Hamilton of the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development designed the Swiss Roll, a floating roadway of waterproofed canvas stiffened with slats. Lieutenant Colonel William Everall and Major Alan Beckett, working in the War Office's Transportation 5 Department, designed a torsionally flexible floating bridge linked to a pier head with 4 legs that rested on the seabed, lowered and raised with the tide. The pierhead design was derived from a Lobnitz dredger. A storm at Garlieston decided the matter. Hughes's hippos were undermined. The crocodile spans failed. Hamilton's Swiss roll washed away. Beckett's whale roadway, the one designed to flex with the swell rather than resist it, came through undamaged. Brigadier Sir Bruce White, the Director of Ports and Inland Water Transport at the War Office, took charge of the engineering. Professor John Bernal of Cambridge, known to his colleagues as the Sage, helped co-manage manufacture. Brigadier Reginald Gwither of the Royal Engineers, later appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire for the work, would supervise assembly on the Normandy coast. You should know who was building this thing, because it is one of the engineering miracles of the war. At peak, 20,000 men were employed on the concrete caissons alone, 10,500 labourers, 1,000 scaffolders, 5,000 carpenters, 770 steel fixers. Across the full project, including the steel and the bridging components and the dewatering of London's East India Dock and South Dock to use them as construction basins, the workforce ran into the tens of thousands more. The War Office issued more than 130,000 prints of working drawings dealing with the caissons. Construction sites included London, Middlesbrough, Goole, Southampton, Tilbury, Plymouth, and 23 slipway units at Stokes Bay, Stone Point, and Langston harbours. 19 British civil engineering firms shared the contracts. 545,000 cubic yards of reinforced concrete, 66,000 tons of reinforcing steel, 9,000 standards of timber, 440,000 square yards of plywood, 97 miles of steel wire rope. What they were building was 2 complete prefabricated artificial harbours. Each harbour had several layers. On the outside, 24 cruciform steel breakwaters called bombardons, each 200 feet long, anchored in a 1-mile arc to break the worst of the swell. Inside the bombardons, a line of 213 reinforced concrete units called Phoenix caissons sunk to form a continuous breakwater. The largest of the Phoenix caissons measured 60 meters long, 20 meters wide, 18 meters high. That is a building. A 6-story building, made of concrete, displacing over 6,000 tons, towed across the English Channel. Inside the breakwater, 61 obsolete ships, called gooseberries or corncobs, were scuttled to make sheltered anchorages. Among them was the old British battleship HMS Centurion, launched in 1911, and the French battleship Corbeil, and the Dutch cruiser HNL-MS Sumatra, and a long roster of Liberty ships and tramp steamers no longer needed for active duty. The retired ships were sunk in line. Their rusting superstructures showed above the waterline like a ghost fleet, the masts and funnels rising from the salt water as if at anchor in a graveyard. Inside the breakwater they made, the spud pier heads stood on their 4 legs on the seabed, decks floating up and down with the 23-foot Normandy tide. From the pier heads, the whale roadways ran in floating spans on concrete pontoons called beetles, 10 miles of bridging in total, designed by Beckett to flex with the swell. Beckett also designed the kite anchors that secured the bombardons. The kite anchors had such high holding power that few of them could be recovered after the war. They are still there, off the Normandy coast, buried in the seabed where they were planted in June 1944. When Franklin Roosevelt heard the concept described, he turned to Francis Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, and said something his Secretary of Labor preserved on page 383 of her 1946 memoir, The Roosevelt I Knew. "You know," Roosevelt told her, "that was Churchill's idea. He has 100 a day, and about 4 of them are good. This was one of the 4. There is a story about the demonstration of the concept to Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, on the Queen Mary during the 1943 voyage to the Quebec Conference. Lieutenant Commander D.A. Grant ran a bathtub demonstration. Pound sat on a toilet seat, watching. Grant used a back brush to generate waves in the bath. Paper ships placed in the open water were sunk. Paper ships placed inside an inflated Mae West life preserver, which represented the Mulberry breakwater, survived. This is the kind of moment historians struggle to take seriously, and yet it happened, and the first Sea Lord was convinced. Eisenhower himself recalled the first time he had heard the idea. Mountbatten had raised it at a conference in the spring of 1942. "If ports are not available," Mountbatten had said, "we may have to construct them in pieces and tow them in." Hoots and jeers greeted his suggestion. 2 years later, Eisenhower wrote, it was to become reality. 2 harbours. The British harbour at Arromanches would be designated Mulberry B and would serve the British and Canadian beaches at Gold, Juno, and Sword. The American harbour off St. Laurent and Vierville would be designated Mulberry A and would serve Omaha. Both would be towed in pieces across the channel and assembled in place. Mulberry A would be commanded by Captain Augustus Dayton Clark of the United States Navy, Naval Academy, class of 1922, designated Commander, Task Force 128. The construction work on the American side would be done by the U.S. Navy Civil Engineer Corps, with Seabees, and the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. Mulberry B would be commanded by Lieutenant Colonel G.C.B. Shattuck of the British 20 Port Group, Royal Engineers. Captain Clark sailed for Normandy aboard a submarine chaser, SC-1329, built in 1943 by Sims Brothers of Dorchester, Massachusetts. Riding with the American Mulberry force was Captain Edward Ellsberg, U.S. Navy, the most celebrated marine salvage expert in the American naval establishment. Ellsberg had volunteered to help solve the engineering problem of refloating the Phoenix caissons in the right place at the right tide. He had ridden a Phoenix caisson across the channel personally, on a 60-meter concrete box behind a tug in the chop of the central channel. The components began crossing on the afternoon of June 6, 1944. 400 Mulberry units in aggregate, 1.5 million tons of towed material, pulled by tugboats at roughly 4 knots. Some of the Phoenix caissons had Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft towers mounted on top, with British gunners crewing them through the slow crossing. Imagine the picture: a great grey procession of concrete buildings under tow, in line abreast, moving across the channel chop at the pace of a fast walk. The tugs ahead of them, the bombardons and beetles and whale spans in their own slower columns behind. The entire English Channel filled with the floating components of 2 complete ports. From the air, once the Mulberries were assembled, the view was stranger still. A great oval breakwater of concrete caissons and scuttled merchant ships, enclosing roughly 2 square miles of sheltered water. The bombardons riding the swell in their outer arc, the pier heads standing on their 4 legs in the middle of the artificial harbour, the whale roadways flexing on their beetles between the pier heads and the beach, DUKWs cutting wakes across the sheltered water, and on the beach itself the columns of trucks and tanks moving inland. 2 complete deep water ports, sitting on a stretch of coast where 5 weeks earlier there had been only sand and the dunes behind it. The German aerial reconnaissance, when it managed to get a plane over Normandy through the Allied fighter cover, photographed all of this. By then the photographs no longer needed interpreting. What were the Germans seeing before all of this assembled? This is the linchpin of the story, and we have the answer in the words of Vice Admiral Ruge himself. The last air photographs made before the invasion, Ruge wrote, were from May 25. We got some good pictures of towed Mulberry components but failed to recognize their full significance. They were labeled as probable landing piers. Probable landing piers. Read those 3 words again. The Germans had photographed the Mulberry components under tow off the southern English coast in late May 1944. The Luftwaffe interpreters had looked at the photographs. They had captioned them. They had noted that the objects appeared to be some form of landing equipment. They had then filed the photographs and moved on. Nobody on the German side connected those photographs to a complete prefabricated harbour system that would render the seizure of a major port unnecessary. The doctrine had so completely captured the German imagination that even when the components were photographed in plain sight, they were classified within the existing assumption. They were landing piers. The Germans knew the Allies might use landing piers as a stopgap, the way armies always improvise. The idea that the piers were a substitute for a port, not a supplement to one, did not enter German thinking. Ruge listed the requests Rommel had been making during the spring of 1944. Rommel applied for the opening of V1 fire on the assembly areas in southern England. He applied for air attacks on Southampton and Portsmouth. He applied for the laying of oyster mines in the channels leading to sea from these ports. He applied for the movement of 2 armoured divisions and the Flak Corps to Normandy. Not a single one of the requests, Ruge wrote, was granted. The man who knew the wall best, who had stood on the beaches at low tide and seen how thin the German line was, asked for the only measures that might have disrupted the Allied logistics build-up and was told no every time. The components crossed. The first Phoenix caisson was sunk at Arromanches at dawn on June 8, 1944. By June 15, 115 more had been sunk, in a 5-mile arc between Tracy-sur-Mer and Asnelles. By June 18, 2 piers and 4 pier heads were working. Ships were unloading at the pier heads, and trucks were rolling down the whale roadways and onto the beach without ever touching salt water. The Mulberry was working. Mulberry B was working as designed. Mulberry A at Omaha was working too, though the American assembly had been less attentive to detail. The Royal Navy's high holding power kite anchors, which Beckett had designed and which the Royal Engineers had used on Mulberry B, had been omitted from the American bombardons. The Americans used hemp rope instead. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, or your brother served, his name belongs in the comments, his branch, his unit, his theatre. Many of you grew up hearing his stories. Many of you grew up around his silence. Either way, his name belongs here. These records matter, and the men in them are slipping out of living memory faster than any of us would like. On June 19, 1944, a storm came up out of the northeast. Royal Engineer Major Ronald Cowan, who was at Arromanches, described it later as such as had not been seen in the Channel for 80 years, second only to the storm that smashed the Spanish Armada in 1588. The storm blew force 6 to force 8 for 3 days. Modern meteorological hindcast modelling, published by Professor Alistair Adcock of Oxford University using European Centre data, has found that a storm of this severity in summer would only be expected once in roughly 40 years. That is the kind of storm it was. A statistical freak that arrived in the worst possible week for the Allied logistical effort. Mulberry A was destroyed. 21 of the 28 Phoenix caissons in the American harbour were broken up entirely. The bombardons, secured with hemp rope rather than the kite anchors used by the British, broke their moorings and became free-floating concrete and steel missiles, tumbling through the harbour and possibly doing more damage to the rest of the structure than the storm itself. By June 22, when the wind dropped, the American harbour was unusable. The British harbour at Arromanches, sheltered slightly by the natural Calvados shoal, secured with kite anchors more attentively assembled, came through battered but functional. This was the moment when the entire Allied logistical effort could have collapsed. 3 weeks into the lodgment, Cherbourg not yet taken. The American beach without its harbour. The channel still rough. The standard German operational answer to this kind of crisis would have been a counterattack while the supply system was disrupted, and the German command in the West had been planning exactly that, though it would be diverted by the relentless Allied air power and the slowness of the German armoured reserves to reach Normandy. Here is what happened instead. The American commanders did not rebuild Mulberry A. They surveyed the damage, made the engineering judgment that it could not be put back together in time to matter, and cannibalized the surviving components. The intact pieces of Mulberry A, including 6 Phoenix caissons and a number of whale spans, were transferred to Arromanches to reinforce Mulberry B. The decision to abandon the American harbour entirely is one of the underappreciated logistical pivots of the war. It carries an American signature, and it bet the campaign on a piece of equipment the Americans had built in enormous quantity and never planned to use this way. The decision was made possible by the landing ship tank. The LST could deliberately beach itself at low tide, drop its bow ramp on the sand, discharge its cargo of trucks and tanks and ammunition directly across the wet sand to waiting drivers, and refloat itself at the next high tide to go back to England for another load. The ship was an Anglo-American design, and the United States had built it in extraordinary numbers by the spring of 1944. Hundreds of LSTs began doing exactly this off Omaha and Utah through July, August, and September of 1944. They beached at low tide, they unloaded in the dry, they refloated, they went back. The cycle was the artificial harbour. The DUKW, the American amphibious truck, made the rest of the system work. 6 wheels on land, a single propeller in the water. The DUKW could swim from a transport ship to the beach and then drive up the sand without transferring its load. Boxes of rations, drums of fuel, ammunition crates loaded onto the truck on the English coast, came off the truck in a field behind Omaha without ever being touched in between. Captain Ellsberg, who had ridden a Phoenix caisson across the channel and who had been brought across to solve harbour engineering problems, instead spent the days after the storm unsnarling wrecked landing craft so the LSTs and DUKWs could continue to land cargo at Omaha. Captain Clark, who had commanded the American harbour, was reassigned as Chief of Staff to Rear Admiral John Wilkes, the commander of ports and bases in France. The harbour he had been sent to operate no longer existed. The job he was given instead was to make sure the lack of a harbour did not matter. Look at the tonnage figures. By 30 days after D-Day, Mulberry B at Arromanches was offloading 6,750 tons of supplies per day. The American beach at Omaha, with no artificial harbour, was offloading 1,200 tons. By 60 days, Mulberry B was still at 6,750. Omaha alone was at 10,000. Utah, the other American beach with no harbor of any kind, was at 6,000. The combined American open beach figure of 16,000 tons per day exceeded the British harbor's throughput by a factor of more than 2 to 1. The United States Center for Military History's verdict on this was direct. The tremendous tonnage capacities subsequently developed at both Utah and Omaha were without doubt one of the most significant and gratifying features of the entire Overlord operation. What is striking, looking at the numbers, is that the destruction of Mulberry A did not break the campaign. It demonstrated something the Allies had not known they could do. The Mulberry concept had been built on the assumption that you could not sustain a 1,000,000-man army across an open beach. The destruction of Mulberry A proved you could. Mulberry B at Arromanches would continue to operate from June 1944 to March 1945, 10 months. It had been designed for 3. Across those 10 months it landed close to 2.5 million men, 4 million tons of supplies, and 500,000 vehicles. Churchill, visiting the harbour on July 23, 1944, called it a miraculous port that had played and would continue to play a most important part in the liberation of Europe. And Cherbourg, the port the Germans had assumed the Allies would have to take? Cherbourg fell on June 27, 1944, 3 weeks into the American attack on the Cotentin Peninsula. The German garrison commander, General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, had used those 3 weeks well, from his point of view. His engineers carried out what may be the most thorough port denial sabotage in modern military history. Cranes demolished, quays cratered, warehouses burned, the channel mined with shipwreck and demolition charges. The inner harbour turned into a graveyard of half-sunk hulls. The first freight was not discharged at Cherbourg until July 16, 1944, almost 3 weeks after the city had fallen, and 6 weeks after the invasion had begun. By September, the American engineers had Cherbourg moving more than 17,000 tons a day. But for the 6 most critical weeks of the lodgment, the port the Germans had assumed the Allies needed had been deliberately taken out of the equation by the Germans themselves. And it had not mattered. The Allied campaign in Normandy, in those 6 weeks, had landed the men and the trucks and the ammunition and the fuel for a 1,000,000-man army across an open beach and across one British artificial harbour, and the army had broken out at St. Lo and was racing for Paris while the Cherbourg sabotage crews were still being rounded up. This is the operational reality behind Speer's verdict. The wall had been built to force the Allies to fight for a port. The Mulberry had been designed to make the port unnecessary. When the storm destroyed Mulberry A and the American beach proved you could sustain a campaign without any artificial harbour at all, the wall's central premise collapsed entirely. A note here on what Speer was actually praising, because the historical record matters more than the dramatic shape of the story. The Mulberry concept was British in origin, Churchill in 1917, Churchill on May 30, 1942. Beckett, Bernal, Bruce White, Iris Hughes, all British. The labour was British and Irish, and the construction sites were British docks. Mulberry A was operated by the United States Navy, and Mulberry A was the one that failed in the storm. The American share of the achievement Speer is praising was operational, not conceptual. The United States built the LSTs and the DUKWs and the Liberty ships in the quantities that made the open beach sustainment work. The American Civil Engineer Corps and Seabees built Mulberry A. The American command, when Mulberry A was destroyed, made the decision to land the rest of the war across the sand at Omaha and Utah, and the engineering equipment in the American supply pipeline let them do it. What Speer is praising, in the German of his memoir, is a genialer Einfall, a stroke of ingenious thought, and an Erfindung, an invention. Neither word is national. He is praising the entire Anglo-American doctrine of beach sustainment, and the operational decision after June 19 that turned a British engineering concept into a strategic fact. In the years after the war, the German commanders sat for their interrogations and wrote their memoirs and tried to make sense of what had happened. Rundstedt to Shulman in 1945 and 46, calling the wall sheer humbug. Rommel, in private to his confidants before the bomb plot and the forced suicide that ended his life on October 14, 1944, calling it cloud-cuckoo-land. Ruge in 1954, in the United States Naval Institute proceedings, describing the probable landing piers and the requests Rommel had made that were never granted. Speer in 1969, calling the entire 2-year effort brought to naught. There is a darker Speer voice. In Spandau prison, alone in his cell, Speer wrote diaries that were eventually published in 1975 and translated as Spandau, the Secret Diaries. The voice in those diaries is harsher than the voice of the memoir. In the memoir, the Mulberry is a stroke of simple genius, and the wall is a tribute to Allied ingenuity. In the Spandau diary on the same subject, Speer wrote one sentence: "All this expenditure of effort was sheer waste. That is the verdict the post-war Speer could write only in private." 300,000 workers, 13 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.5 million tons of steel, 3.7 billion Reichsmarks, 120,000 German soldiers lost inside the concrete posts that Rundstedt had told Hitler were tactically useless. All of it, sheer waste. The architectural historian Joseph Reichwart, writing many years later for a Royal Geographic Society exhibition catalogue, called the Atlantic Wall a lasting token of a mighty miscalculation. The miscalculation was not the engineering. The engineering was, if anything, too good. The German bunkers at Pointe du Hoc and along the Calais coast are still there. They survived 80 years of weather and salt water, and they will survive another 80. The miscalculation was the doctrine. Hitler, Rundstedt, Rommel, and the Kriegsmarine all believed the same thing about how an invasion fleet had to be supplied, and they all built their plans on the assumption that the Allies believed it too. They were right that the Allies believed it. The Allies believed it so completely that they spent the equivalent of a small national budget building 2 artificial harbours, in case the assumption turned out to be true. Where the Germans got it wrong was in assuming that the Allies, faced with the wall and its port fortresses, would have no other answer. The Allies built 2 ports, towed them across the Channel, and when one of them was destroyed in a once-in-40 years summer storm, the men on the American beach simply landed their cargo on the sand and kept the war moving. The wall, designed to channel the invasion toward the fortified ports, channeled it instead toward the one stretch of coast where the engineers and the seamen had decided in advance that the port did not matter. The Phoenix caissons are still there. Several of them sit half-submerged off Arromanches, where they have sat for 82 years now, weathering. 2 more sit in Portland Harbour in Dorset, where they were left after the war. Their listing entry in the Historic England Register notes that each one weighs 7,113.8 tons. They are visited by tourists and by the children and grandchildren of the men who built them and the men who landed under their protection. They are slowly dissolving in the salt water that they were not designed to last in. The kite anchors are still there too, on the seabed off Normandy, where Beckett's design held against the storm that broke the bombardon. A full-size replica stands at the Beckett Memorial at Arromanches. The original anchors will be there long after the replica is gone, holding their grip in the sand, attached to nothing. If you stayed with this story to the end, a like helps the next person find it. If you want more like this, subscribe. Major Alan Beckett of the British War Office, the Royal Engineer who designed the Whale Roadway and the kite anchors that held Mulberry B together through the storm, was honoured after the war for his work, and continued in civil engineering for the rest of his career. His anchors held for 8 decades and are still holding now. Captain Augustus Dayton Clark, United States Navy, Naval Academy class of 1922, who commanded Mulberry A at Omaha and rode the storm out at the head of Task Force 128, was reassigned afterward as Chief of Staff to the Commander of Ports and Bases in France, continued to serve through the end of the war, and lived until 1990. Captain Edward Ellsberg, the American naval salvage expert who rowed a Phoenix caisson across the Channel and who spent the post-storm days unsnarling Omaha, survived the war. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, the German naval advisor who wrote the most precise account we have of how the Mulberry photographs were filed as probable landing piers, served the Federal Republic of Germany after the war and wrote his memoirs. He died in 1985. Albert Speer, who had built the wall and then in his memoir written that it had been brought to naught by an idea of simple genius, was released from Spandau on October 1, 1966. He died of a stroke in London on September 1, 1981, the 42nd anniversary of the German invasion of Poland. 300,000 labourers on the wall, most of them forced. 13 million cubic metres of concrete. 1.5 million tons of steel. 120,000 German soldiers lost inside the concrete after the lodgment had been won. The American LSTs and DUKWs and CBs and engineers and sailors who proved you could sustain an invasion across an open beach. The British engineers who designed a harbour that could be towed. The wall that pointed in the wrong direction. Their names belong in the record. That is why we tell these stories.